The heavy wooden doors of Sacramento County Courthouse Courtroom 4B groaned open at precisely 9:47 a.m. 13 minutes late, an ominous start to what would become one of the most extraordinary custody hearings in California legal history. 8-year-old Emma Rodriguez stepped across the threshold like a condemned prisoner entering her final trial, her tiny fingers wrapped around a threadbare teddy bear that had seen better days. The bear's left eye hung by a single thread, its brown fur matted from countless nights of desperate hugging, silent witness to tears that fell when no human was watching. Emma's parents flanked her like opposing armies preparing for battle. Maria Rodriguez sat rigidly in the plaintiff's section, her designer handbag clutched so tightly her knuckles had turned white beneath perfectly manicured nails. She wore a navy blue suit that screamed respectability, carefully chosen by her attorney to project maternal stability. But her eyes told a different story, darting nervously between her daughter and her ex-husband with the calculating intensity of a chess master plotting her next move. Every few seconds, she would smooth her already perfect hair, a nervous tick that betrayed the anxiety churning beneath her composed exterior. On the opposite side, David Rodriguez slouched in his chair with the defeated posture of a man who had already lost everything that mattered. His rumpled gray suit hung loosely on his frame, 20 pounds lighter than he'd been when this legal nightmare began 8 months ago. Dark circles under his eyes spoke of sleepless nights spent staring at ceiling fans and wondering how his fairy-tale marriage had become this courtroom battlefield. His work-worn hands trembled slightly as he adjusted his tie for the 15th time, a habit that had developed since the divorce papers were served on that rainy Tuesday that changed everything. Judge Margaret Chun entered her domain with the measured stride of someone who had presided over human tragedy for 3 decades. At 62, she had seen it all, or so she believed. Her silver hair was pulled back in a severe bun that emphasized the sharp intelligence in her dark eyes. The black robes of justice hung from her shoulders like the wings of some ancient deity, and when she took her seat behind the massive oak bench, the entire room seemed to hold its breath. She had a reputation for cutting through legal theatrics to reach the heart of each case, but today something felt different. The air itself seemed charged with electricity, as if the building knew that history was about to be made within these walls. The court reporter, Janet Walsh, settled behind her stenography machine with practiced efficiency. 43 years old and a veteran of thousands of hearings, Janet could usually predict how each case would unfold within the first 10 minutes. Divorce, custody battles, property disputes, they all followed familiar patterns. But as she positioned her fingers over the keys, she noticed something unusual. Emma wasn't just another scared child caught in adult warfare. There was something almost ethereal about her silence, as if she were carrying secrets that could reshape the very foundation of this proceeding. Attorney Rebecca Morrison represented Maria Rodriguez with the fierce determination of a woman who had never lost a custody case. Her burgundy briefcase lay open beside her, revealing meticulously organized files that painted David Rodriguez as an unfit father. She had photographs, witness statements, and expert testimony that would systematically dismantle his character. Her strategy was simple: present Maria as the stable, nurturing mother while exposing David's alleged shortcomings. She glanced at her client with the confidence of a general who had already won the war. Across the aisle, Public Defender Marcus Thompson shuffled through his much thinner case file with barely concealed desperation. David couldn't afford a high-powered attorney, so the state had assigned Marcus a dedicated man fighting an uphill battle with limited resources. His strategy relied heavily on David's genuine love for Emma and his willingness to do whatever was necessary for her well-being. But love, Marcus knew from bitter experience, didn't always triumph in courtrooms, where wealth and influence often tipped the scales of justice. The bailiff, Officer Rodriguez, no relation to the family, despite the shared surname, stood at attention at the back of the courtroom. At 55, he had witnessed enough family destruction to fill several lifetimes. But something about today made his instincts prickle with unease. The child's profound stillness was unsettling, not the typical fidgeting of nervous children, but an almost supernatural calm that seemed to ripple outward from her small presence. Outside, the October sky darkened ominously as storm clouds gathered with unusual intensity. The weather forecast had predicted light rain, but nature seemed determined to provide a more dramatic backdrop for the day's events. Lightning flickered in the distance, and the first rumbles of thunder began to vibrate through the courthouse's century-old walls. The American flag outside the building snapped violently in the rising wind, its stars and stripes a patriotic reminder that justice, like weather, could change without warning. Emma sat between her warring parents, a tiny island of silence in a sea of adult hostility. Her legs didn't reach the floor, leaving her feet to dangle helplessly above the worn courtroom carpet. The teddy bear remained pressed against her chest, like armor against the emotional violence swirling around her. But her eyes, those remarkable hazel eyes that seemed far too old for her 8-year-old face, held a depth that made everyone who looked into them feel as though they were glimpsing something profound and unknowable. As Judge Chun called the court to order with 3 sharp raps of her gavel, none of the adults in courtroom 4B could have imagined that within the next 2 hours they would witness an event that would challenge everything they believed about communication, trust, and the mysterious bonds that connect living beings across species lines. The storm gathering outside was nothing compared to the tempest of revelation about to be unleashed by one small girl who had learned to speak without words. The heavy oak doors of courtroom 4B burst open with a force that seemed to defy the building's usual reverent silence, as if destiny itself had decided to make an entrance. The sound echoed through the chamber like a gunshot, causing every head to turn in unison toward the unexpected interruption. Judge Chun's gavel froze mid-air, her prepared statement dying on her lips as she witnessed something that had never occurred in her 30 years on the bench. Officer Sarah Mitchell stepped through the doorway with the confidence of someone who belonged everywhere she went, but even she seemed surprised by the dramatic nature of her entrance. At 34, Sarah had served with the Sacramento County Sheriff's Department for 12 years, specializing in courthouse security and crisis intervention. Her uniform was crisp and professional, but her eyes held the warmth of someone who genuinely cared about the people she served. Today, however, those eyes sparkled with an unusual mixture of confusion and curiosity. She hadn't been scheduled to appear in any courtroom proceedings, but it wasn't Sarah who commanded the room's attention. Walking beside her with regal dignity was a magnificent golden retriever, whose presence seemed to transform the sterile courtroom into something altogether more profound. The dog moved with the fluid grace of an athlete, each step deliberate and purposeful. His coat gleamed like spun gold under the fluorescent lights, and his intelligent amber eyes surveyed the room with an awareness that seemed almost human. Around his chest, a blue vest bore the word Justice in bold white letters, a name that would prove more prophetic than anyone could imagine. Justice stood 68 pounds of perfectly trained canine excellence. His lineage traced back to championship bloodlines, but his real pedigree lay in 18 months of intensive training at the California Service Dog Institute. He had been selected from a litter of 12 puppies for his exceptional emotional intelligence and his uncanny ability to read human distress signals that even trained psychologists might miss. His certification included crisis intervention, PTSD support, and childhood trauma detection skills that made him invaluable in high-stress legal environments. The courtroom erupted in confused murmurs. Attorney Rebecca Morrison half rose from Her chair, her perfectly planned strategy suddenly derailed by this four-legged wild card. "Your Honor," she began, her voice sharp with indignation, "there are no animals scheduled for this proceeding." "I must object to." Judge Chun raised her hand for silence, but her eyes remained fixed on the extraordinary scene unfolding before her. She had seen therapy dogs in courtrooms before, usually prearranged for particularly traumatic cases involving child witnesses. But this felt different. Justice hadn't simply entered the room. He had arrived with purpose, as if answering some silent summons that only he could hear. "Officer Mitchell," Judge Chun's voice carried its usual authority, but curiosity softened its edges. "I don't recall authorizing a service animal for today's proceedings. Can you explain your presence here?" Sarah shifted uncomfortably, her hand automatically reaching down to touch Justice's head, a gesture that seemed to calm both the dog and herself. "Your Honor, I received an emergency request approximately 15 minutes ago from Dr. Patricia Williams, the court-appointed child psychologist. She indicated that the minor in this case was showing signs of severe emotional distress during the preliminary interview and requested Justice's presence as a comfort measure." Dr. Williams, who had been sitting quietly in the gallery, stood with evident relief. A woman in her late 50s with silver-streaked hair and kind eyes magnified by wire-rimmed glasses. She had spent her career specializing in childhood trauma and court testimony. "Your Honor, I've been working with Emma for the past 3 weeks, and I've never encountered a child so profoundly shut down. She hasn't spoken more than a dozen words in our sessions combined. When I saw her condition this morning, the trembling, the dissociation, the complete withdrawal, I felt that extraordinary measures were necessary." Justice, meanwhile, seemed oblivious to the adult conversation swirling around him. His attention had focused with laser intensity on one small figure in the room, Emma Rodriguez. The 8-year-old sat motionless between her parents, but something fundamental had shifted in her demeanor. A death grip on her teddy bear had loosened slightly, and for the first time since entering the courtroom, her head had lifted. Her hazel eyes, which had stared blankly at the floor throughout the morning's preliminaries, now tracked Justice's every movement with an intensity that made the adults around her fade into background noise. David Rodriguez leaned forward in his chair, his exhausted features brightening with the first hope he'd felt in months. As a construction foreman, he had always connected better with animals than with people, and he recognized something in his daughter's expression that he hadn't seen since before the divorce proceedings began. "She loves dogs," he whispered to his attorney, his voice thick with emotion. "We had to give away her puppy when Maria and I separated. She cried for weeks." Maria Rodriguez's reaction was markedly different. Her perfectly composed mask slipped slightly, revealing a flash of panic. This wasn't part of the plan. Her strategy depended on maintaining control of every variable in the courtroom, and this golden-haired interloper represented chaos incarnate. She gripped her purse tighter, her knuckles white with tension as she calculated how this development might affect her case. Justice took 3 measured steps forward, his paws silent on the worn carpet. He stopped directly in the center of the courtroom, equidistant from all the human drama, but with his gaze locked on Emma. His tail remained still not wagging with typical canine enthusiasm, but alert and ready. His ears swiveled forward, and his head tilted slightly to the right, a gesture that Sarah had learned to recognize as Justice's analysis mode. The dog was reading the room with an accuracy that would have impressed a seasoned detective, but his primary focus remained on the small girl who seemed to draw his attention like a magnet. The thunder outside grew louder, rattling the courthouse windows as nature provided a soundtrack for the supernatural drama unfolding within. Lightning illuminated the courtroom through the tall windows, casting dramatic shadows that seemed to emphasize the otherworldly quality of the moment. In that charged atmosphere, with rain beginning to pelt the glass and electricity crackling through the air, everyone present sensed they were witnessing the beginning of something unprecedented, though none could have predicted the miracle about to unfold. Judge Chun's voice cut through the tension-filled courtroom with the practiced authority of 3 decades on the bench. "Emma Rodriguez, please approach the witness stand." The words hung in the air like a death sentence, each syllable carrying the weight of a child's future. The courtroom fell into the kind of profound silence that seemed to press against the walls themselves, broken only by the steady drumming of rain against the tall windows and the occasional rumble of thunder that seemed to echo Emma's internal turmoil. Emma's small body went rigid at the sound of her name. Her hazel eyes, which had been tracking Justice's every movement with newfound interest, suddenly darted between her parents with the terrified look of a cornered animal. The threadbare teddy bear, pressed against her chest, seemed to offer little comfort now, its one good eye staring accusingly at the adults who had created this impossible situation. Her legs, already too short to reach the floor from her chair, began to tremble with a violence that made the entire row of seats vibrate. Maria Rodriguez leaned forward slightly, her perfectly manicured fingers clasping together in what appeared to be prayer, but was actually a calculated gesture designed to show maternal concern for the court record. Her lips moved almost imperceptibly, not in prayer, but in the silent repetition of the words she had drilled into Emma's head during countless practice sessions over the past month. "Remember what Mommy told you about Daddy," she had whispered. During car rides to school, during bedtime stories, during every private moment they shared. "You need to tell the judge the truth about how he scares you." Across the aisle, David Rodriguez sat slumped in his chair like a man watching his own execution. His work-calloused hands gripped the armrests so tightly that his knuckles had gone white, and his jaw worked silently as he fought back words he couldn't say in this formal setting. He wanted to call out to his daughter, to tell her it was okay, that she didn't have to be afraid, that whatever she said wouldn't change how much he loved her. But his attorney had warned him repeatedly about any appearance of coaching or influencing Emma's testimony. The irony wasn't lost on him. He was being punished for the very thing his ex-wife had been doing systematically for months. Emma rose from her seat with the mechanical movements of a marionette controlled by invisible strings, each step toward the witness stand seemed to take an eternity, her small feet barely making a sound on the worn carpet. The distance couldn't have been more than 20 feet, but it might as well have been 20 miles for the courage it required. Behind her, she could feel the weight of adult expectations, the crushing burden of choosing between the two people who were supposed to protect her but had instead made her their battlefield. Justice, still standing motionless in the center of the courtroom, turned his magnificent head to track Emma's progress. His amber eyes followed her with an intensity that seemed to pierce through all the legal formality to see the terrified child beneath. His tail remained still, but his ears swiveled forward in what Officer Mitchell recognized as his high alert position, the stance he took when detecting severe emotional distress in a vulnerable person. The witness stand loomed before Emma like a throne she was unworthy to occupy. The microphone, adjusted to adult height, pointed accusingly at empty air above her head. The leather chair, cracked from years of use, seemed enormous enough to swallow her whole. Bailiff Rodriguez stepped forward with practiced efficiency, producing a booster seat that would bring Emma to the proper height, a reminder of just how small and powerless she truly was in this arena of adult warfare. "Please raise your right hand," instructed Court Clerk Mrs. Patterson, a grandmother of 6 who had administered this oath thousands of times, but never to a child who looked so thoroughly broken. "Do you solemnly swear to tell the truth, whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?" Emma's right hand rose with agonizing slowness, trembling so violently that several jurors wait. This was family court. There was no jury. Several observers in the gallery shifted uncomfortably, recognizing the moral weight being placed on shoulders far too young to bear it. Her voice, when it finally came, was barely a whisper. "I do." But even those two small words seemed to cost her everything, leaving her visibly depleted and more fragile than before. Attorney Rebecca Morrison approached the witness stand with the predatory grace of a shark sensing blood in the water. Her burgundy suit clicked against her legs as she walked, each step calculated to project confidence and authority. She had demolished adult witnesses with her surgical precision. Surely one frightened 8-year-old wouldn't present any challenge. "Emma, sweetie," she began, her voice dripping with manufactured warmth, "I want you to tell the judge about living with your daddy. Does he ever make you feel scared?" The question hung in the air, like a poisoned arrow seeking its target. Emma's mouth opened, then closed, then opened again, without producing any sound. Her eyes found her mother's face in the gallery, saw the slight nod of encouragement, the meaningful look that reminded her of all their practiced conversations. Then her gaze shifted to her father, saw the devastation in his eyes, the way his shoulders sagged with the weight of anticipated betrayal. Minutes ticked by on the courtroom clock, each second marked by the sound of rain against glass and Emma's increasingly labored breathing. The court reporter's fingers hovered over her keys, waiting for words that refused to come. Judge Chun leaned forward slightly, her expression softening from judicial authority to human concern. She had seen reluctant witnesses before, but never a child who seemed to be literally choking on the words she was expected to say. "Take your time, Emma," Judge Chun said gently. "There's no rush. Just tell us what you feel comfortable sharing." But Emma's comfort had been destroyed months ago, in the crossfire of her parents' mutual destruction. She was trapped between two versions of truth, each one a betrayal of someone she loved. Her small voice finally emerged, weak and barely audible. I don't know what to say." And in that moment of profound honesty, she unknowingly set the stage for a miracle that would reshape everyone's understanding of communication, trust, and the mysterious ways that help can arrive when least expected. The silence in courtroom 4B had become a living entity, pressing against every surface and person with suffocating intensity. Emma sat frozen in the witness chair, like a small statue carved from desperation, her hazel eyes wide with the terror of a child caught between impossible choices. The microphone in front of her seemed to mock her silence, amplifying nothing but the soft sound of her increasingly rapid breathing. Outside, lightning split the darkening sky with violent beauty, illuminating the courtroom in stark, dramatic flashes that seemed to pulse in rhythm with Emma's racing heartbeat. Attorney Rebecca Morrison stood before the witness stand with growing frustration etched across her angular features. Her carefully orchestrated questioning strategy was crumbling before her eyes as Emma remained locked in silence. The burgundy leather briefcase at her feet contained dozens of carefully prepared questions, designed to extract the testimony that would secure Maria Rodriguez's custody victory. But none of her legal training had prepared her for a witness who simply refused to participate in the theater of justice. "Emma," Rebecca tried again, her voice taking on a sharper edge despite her attempts to maintain a gentle tone. "I know this is difficult, but the court needs to hear from you. Your mother has told us about some concerning incidents with your father. Can you tell Jun about the time your daddy yelled so loudly that you hid in your closet?" The question struck Emma like a physical blow. Her small hands gripped the arms of the witness chair until her knuckles went white, and her breathing became so shallow that Dr. Patricia Williams half rose from her seat in the gallery, ready to intervene if the child hyperventilated. Emma's mouth opened and closed soundlessly, like a fish gasping for air in a world that had suddenly become too hostile to breathe. That's when justice moved. without any visible command from Officer Sarah Mitchell, without any signal that the humans in the courtroom could detect. The magnificent golden retriever suddenly lifted his head with the sharp alertness of a predator who had caught a scent. His amber eyes, which had been maintaining a watchful but relaxed surveillance of the proceedings, suddenly locked on to Emma with laser-like intensity. His entire body language shifted from passive observation to active engagement, as if an invisible switch had been flipped in his canine consciousness. Sarah Mitchell felt her breath catch in her throat. In her 12 years of working with service dogs, she had never seen Justice respond to a situation without explicit direction. Her hand instinctively moved toward the radio on her belt, ready to call for backup if the dog was having some kind of medical emergency. But Justice's posture wasn't erratic or confused. It was purposeful, alert, and somehow profoundly intelligent in a way that defied conventional understanding of animal behavior. Justice took one measured step toward the witness stand, his paws silent on the worn carpet despite his 68-pound frame. His movement was fluid and deliberate, like a dancer who knew exactly where each step should fall. The adults in the courtroom began to murmur with confusion and concern, but Justice seemed oblivious to their anxiety. His attention was focused entirely on Emma, as if she were the only person in the universe who mattered. Emma's response was immediate and startling. The moment Justice moved, her rigid posture relaxed slightly, and her wild, panicked breathing began to slow. Her hazel eyes, which had been darting frantically between her parents and the attorney, settled on the approaching dog with something that looked almost like relief. For the first time since taking the witness stand, Emma's expression showed a flicker of hope, as if she had spotted a lighthouse beacon cutting through a storm-tossed night. Judge Chun leaned forward in her chair, her 30 years of judicial experience providing no framework for what she was witnessing. She had seen therapy dogs work with traumatized children before, but always under controlled circumstances, with trained handlers directing every interaction. This felt different, spontaneous, organic, and somehow more profound than any therapeutic intervention she had ever observed. Then it happened. Emma's right hand, which had been gripping the chair arm with desperate intensity, slowly relaxed. Her small fingers moved with deliberate precision, forming a subtle gesture that looked to most observers like random fidgeting or perhaps a nervous tic. Her thumb pressed against her palm, while her index and middle fingers curved slightly upward, creating a shape that seemed meaningless to the untrained eye. The movement was so small, so seemingly insignificant, that several people in the courtroom missed it entirely. But Justice didn't miss it. The dog's ears snapped forward with military precision, and his tail, which had been hanging in a neutral position, suddenly went rigid with attention. His intelligent amber eyes widened slightly, and his head tilted 15 degrees to the right, a gesture that Sarah Mitchell had learned to recognize as Justice's message-received position. The transformation in the dog's demeanor was so complete and immediate that it sent chills down Sarah's spine. "What just happened?" whispered Public Defender Marcus Thompson to his client, David Rodriguez. But David was too mesmerized by what he was witnessing to respond. He had always known his daughter was special, but this seemed to transcend anything he could have imagined. Justice took another step forward, this time with even greater purpose. His movement was no longer exploratory, it was responsive, as if he were answering a direct request that only he could hear. The courtroom's ambient noise, the shuffling of papers, the creaking of chairs, the whispered conversations, seemed to fade into background, static as everyone present focused on the extraordinary communication unfolding before their eyes. Emma's gesture had lasted only 3 seconds, but its impact reverberated through the courtroom like a stone dropped into still water. Justice's response left no doubt that something profound had just occurred, a moment of interspecies communication that challenged every assumption about language, understanding, and the mysterious connections that bind living creatures together. Officer Mitchell found herself holding her breath as she watched her partner engage in what could only be described as a conversation without words. Her training had taught her to recognize Justice's various behavioral signals, but this was entirely new territory. The dog was operating on a level of awareness that transcended his extensive training, responding to something that existed beyond the realm of conventional commands and responses. The storm outside seemed to pause, as if nature itself were holding its breath to witness this unprecedented moment of connection between a traumatized child and a dog who somehow understood her. Silent cry for help. What happened next would be debated, analyzed, and retold in legal circles for decades to come. But in that electrifying moment, the 73 people present in Courtroom 4B witnessed something that defied every law of probability, training, protocol, and rational explanation. Justice moved like liquid lightning, his powerful frame covering the remaining distance to the witness, stand in 3 fluid strides that seemed to bend the very fabric of space and time around him. The courtroom erupted into chaos as Justice executed what could only be described as an impossible maneuver. Without hesitation, without any verbal command from his handler, without any of the standard protocols that govern service dog behavior, he reared up on his hind legs and placed his massive golden head directly onto Emma's lap. The movement was so swift, so precise, and so completely unexpected that several observers gasped audibly, their voices creating a discordant symphony of shock that echoed off the courtroom's high ceilings. Attorney Rebecca Morrison stumbled backward, her burgundy heels clicking frantically against the polished floor as she nearly collided with the court reporter's station. Her carefully constructed composure shattered like glass, leaving her mouth agape and her eyes wide with disbelief. "Your Honor," she stammered, her voice climbing 2 octaves in panic. "This is highly irregular. I demand that this animal be removed immediately." But even as the words left her lips, she realized how hollow they sounded in the face of what everyone was witnessing. Judge Chan's gavel, which had been poised to restore order to her courtroom, froze mid-air, as if time itself had decided to pause and bear witness to this unprecedented moment. In 30 years of presiding over every conceivable type of legal proceeding, she had developed an almost supernatural ability to maintain judicial composure under any circumstances. She had remained calm during explosive domestic violence cases, maintained order during gang-related trials, and kept her courtroom functioning even when attorneys had literally come to blows before her bench. But this moment stripped away 3 decades of professional distance and left her staring in wonder at something that challenged the very foundations of her understanding of reality. Officer Sarah Mitchell felt her knees buckle slightly as she watched her partner execute a behavior that wasn't part of any training manual ever written. Justice had been conditioned through 18 months of intensive preparation to respond only to specific commands, to maintain professional boundaries at all times, and to never, under any circumstances, initiate contact with a subject without explicit authorization. Yet here he was, not only breaking every protocol in the book, but doing so with such profound purpose that it seemed almost sacred. "Justice down," Sarah commanded, her voice cracking with authority and confusion. But the magnificent golden retriever didn't even acknowledge her presence. His amber eyes remained locked on Emma's face with an intensity that seemed to create an invisible bubble around them, shutting out the rest of the world. His massive head rested against the child's small frame with such gentle precision that it looked as though he were cradling something infinitely precious and fragile. Emma's transformation was nothing short of miraculous. The rigid terror that had paralyzed her since taking the witness stand melted away like ice under a summer sun. Her shoulders, which had been hunched defensively around her ears, relaxed. For the first time in months, The death grip she had maintained on her threadbare teddy bear loosened until the toy rested peacefully in her lap beside Justice's magnificent head. Most remarkably, her breathing, which had been shallow and panicked throughout the morning's proceedings, deepened into the steady rhythm of someone who had finally found safety in a world gone mad. Bailiff Officer Rodriguez stepped forward. With practiced authority, his hand moving instinctively toward his radio to call for additional security. In 28 years of courthouse duty, he had seen everything from bomb threats to full-scale riots, and his training dictated that any uncontrolled animal in a courtroom represented a potential security breach. But something about the profound stillness that had settled over Emma and Justice made him pause, his finger hovering over the radio's call button without pressing it. Dr. Patricia Williams rose from her seat in the gallery, her professional training warring with her human intuition, as she watched the extraordinary scene unfold. Her specialized education in childhood trauma had taught her to recognize therapeutic breakthroughs, but this transcended anything she had ever studied or experienced. Justice wasn't simply providing comfort, he was communicating on a level that seemed to bypass all conventional understanding of how healing actually worked. David Rodriguez felt tears streaming down his weathered cheeks as he watched his daughter's face transform from haunted terror to something approaching peace. As a construction foreman who worked with his hands and spoke in practical terms, he had no framework for understanding what he was witnessing, but his father's heart recognized the miracle of his child's relief. "She's okay," he whispered to his attorney, his voice thick with emotion. "For the first time in months, she's actually okay." Maria Rodriguez's reaction was markedly different. Her perfectly composed mask cracked completely, revealing the raw panic beneath as she watched. Her carefully orchestrated strategy crumbled before her eyes. This golden-haired interloper represented everything she couldn't control, couldn't manipulate, couldn't bend to her will. Her grip on her designer handbag tightened until her knuckles went white, and her breathing became as rapid and shallow as Emma's had been moments before. The storm outside seemed to respond to the intensity of the moment, unleashing a thunderclap so powerful that it rattled the courthouse's century-old windows and caused the lights to flicker ominously. But inside Courtroom 4B, a different kind of electricity crackled through the air, the unmistakable energy of a miracle in progress. Emma's small hand moved with deliberate grace, settling on Justice's golden head with the reverence of someone touching something holy. "He understands me," she whispered, her voice carrying clearly through the stunned silence that had fallen over the courtroom. The words were simple, childlike in their honesty, but they carried the weight of absolute truth that resonated in every heart present. Justice's tail wagged once, a single purposeful movement that seemed to acknowledge Emma's declaration, while simultaneously announcing to everyone present that the impossible had just become reality. In that moment, species barriers dissolved, training protocols became irrelevant, and the mystery of communication revealed itself in its purest form. With Justice's massive golden head resting protectively against her small frame, Emma Rodriguez found a strength she never knew existed within her 8-year-old soul. The courtroom held its collective breath as she straightened in the witness chair, her hazel eyes clearing for the first time in months, like storm clouds parting to reveal brilliant sunshine. Her voice, when it finally emerged, carried the crystal clear ring of absolute truth that cut through the legal posturing and adult manipulation like a sword through silk. "They both told me to lie," Emma declared, her words dropping into the stunned silence with the explosive force of a confession that would reshape every assumption in the room. The simple statement reverberated off the courtroom walls, each syllable carrying the weight of months of suppressed truth. Her small hand remained steady on Justice's head, drawing courage from his unwavering presence as she continued, "Mommy and Daddy both taught me different lies to tell you." The courtroom erupted in barely contained chaos. Attorney Rebecca Morrison's face went ashen as her carefully constructed case began crumbling before her eyes. She had built her entire strategy on the assumption that Emma would deliver the rehearsed testimony about her father's alleged unfitness. But this revelation threatened to expose the very foundation of her client's claims. Her burgundy briefcase, filled with what she had believed were supporting documents, suddenly felt like evidence of a conspiracy rather than tools of justice. Maria Rodriguez shot to her feet with such violence that her chair toppled backward, clattering against the gallery railing with a sound like breaking bones. "That's not true," she shrieked, her perfectly composed mask finally shattering to reveal the desperate woman beneath. "She's confused. She's just a child who doesn't understand." But Judge Chun's raised hand cut off her protests, the judicial authority in that simple gesture more powerful than any gavel strike. Emma's voice grew stronger, fueled by Justice's steady presence and the intoxicating freedom of finally speaking her truth. "Mommy said I had to tell you that Daddy drinks beer all the time and gets angry and throws things. But he doesn't. He only had one beer when we watched the football game, and he never threw anything except the ball in the backyard with me." Her words came faster now, tumbling out like water through a broken dam. "She made me practice saying it over and over in the car, and she said if I didn't tell you those words, I would never see Daddy again." David Rodriguez buried his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs as months of anguish and helplessness finally found release. The accusations that had painted him as an unfit father, the character assassination that had cost him so much, all of it had been orchestrated, manipulation designed to turn his own daughter into a weapon against him. His attorney, Marcus Thompson, placed a supportive hand on his client's shoulder while frantically scribbling notes that would fundamentally alter their legal strategy. But Emma wasn't finished. With Justice's amber eyes providing silent encouragement, she turned her gaze toward her father, and her next words cut even deeper into the web of deceit that had entangled her young life. "And Daddy said I had to tell you that Mommy has men over who are mean to me, and that she locks me in my room and doesn't feed me dinner. But that's not true either. Mr. Johnson from next door just helps fix things when they break, and Mommy never locked me anywhere or forgot to feed me." The revelation struck the courtroom like a second thunderbolt. David Rodriguez's head snapped up, his tear-stained face reflecting the horror of hearing his own manipulation exposed with the same brutal honesty his ex-wife had received. He had convinced himself that coaching Emma was necessary, that Maria's alleged coaching justified his own. But hearing his deception spoken aloud in his daughter's innocent voice made him realize the terrible price of his choices. Dr. Patricia Williams stood slowly from her seat in the gallery, her professional composure barely containing her amazement at what she was witnessing. In 25 years of working with traumatized children, she had never seen a breakthrough this profound or this complete. Emma wasn't just speaking, she was excavating months of buried truth with surgical precision, revealing the systematic, emotional abuse both parents had inflicted through their competing manipulations. Emma's voice took on an edge of pain that made every adult in the room flinch with shame. They both said the other one was bad and scary, and I had to choose who to love more. But I love them both, and I don't want either one to be bad. I just want them to stop making me say things that aren't true. Tears began streaming down her cheeks, but they weren't tears of fear or confusion. They were tears of relief, of finally being able to speak the truth that had been poisoning her young heart. Judge Chun leaned forward, her judicial mask temporarily replaced by the expression of a grandmother who recognized the profound courage it took for a child to expose the adults who were supposed to protect her. "Emma, sweetheart, is there anything else you want to tell the court? Anything about where you feel safest and happiest?" Justice shifted slightly, pressing closer to Emma as if sensing the importance of her next words. The golden retriever's presence seemed to create an invisible shield around the witness stand, protecting the child from the adult expectations and agendas that had trapped her for so long. Emma's hand moved gently through his golden fur as she gathered the courage for her final revelation. "I want to live with Grandma Rosa," Emma said with startling clarity, her voice carrying the conviction of someone who had finally found solid ground after months of quicksand. "She never asks me to say bad things about Mommy or Daddy. She just loves me and makes me feel safe. When I'm with her, I don't have to choose sides or remember which lies I'm supposed to tell. I can just be Emma." The courtroom fell into profound silence as the weight of an 8-year-old's wisdom settled over everyone present. In her simple, honest words, Emma had not only exposed the toxic manipulation that had defined her parents' custody battle, but had also pointed toward a solution that prioritized her well-being over adult pride and vengeance. Justice's tail wagged once, as if approving of her courage, while the storm outside seemed to quiet in respect for the truth that had finally been spoken. The profound silence that followed Emma's testimony hung in the air like morning mist, heavy with the weight of truth and the electric anticipation of understanding. Judge Chun's 30 years of judicial experience had taught her to recognize pivotal moments in legal proceedings, but this transcended anything in her considerable repertoire. The courtroom seemed to hold its breath, waiting for someone to explain how an 8-year-old child had managed to communicate with a service dog in a way that defied every protocol, every training manual, and every rational explanation for animal behavior. Officer Sarah Mitchell rose from her position near the back of the courtroom, her movements deliberate and respectful as she approached the bench. At 34, she had served with distinction in multiple law enforcement capacities, but never had she felt the weight of explaining something that challenged the very foundations of what she thought she knew about human-animal communication. Her uniform, crisp and professional despite the morning's extraordinary events, seemed almost inadequate for the magnitude of what she was about to reveal. "Your Honor," Sarah began, her voice carrying the steady authority of someone trained to deliver clear information under pressure. "With the court's permission, I believe I can provide some context for what we've all witnessed here today." Judge Chun nodded gravely, gesturing for Sarah to continue while the entire courtroom leaned forward with anticipation. Sarah's eyes moved briefly to Justice, who remained motionless beside Emma's chair like a golden guardian angel before she began her explanation. 6 months ago, on March 15th of this year, Justice and I were assigned to conduct a safety demonstration at Maple Elementary School as part of the Sacramento County Sheriff's Department's Community Outreach Program. We visit schools regularly to teach children about personal safety, emergency procedures, and in Justice's case, how specially trained animals can help people during difficult times. The courtroom listened with rapt attention as Sarah painted the picture of that seemingly ordinary spring day. Emma had been in Mrs. Patterson's 3rd grade class, sitting in the second row with 23 other 8- and 9-year-olds, who were more interested in petting the beautiful golden retriever than learning about safety protocols. But Emma had been different. Sarah remembered now, with crystal clarity, she had approached Justice with an unusual combination of caution and intense curiosity that had caught both Sarah's and Justice's attention. During that presentation, Sarah continued, her voice gaining strength as the memory became clearer, I taught the children several basic hand signals that therapy dogs are trained to recognize. These signals are designed to help children communicate when they're too scared or traumatized to speak out loud. It's a non-verbal way for kids to ask for help when words feel impossible. Dr. Patricia Williams nodded from her seat in the gallery, her professional understanding immediately grasping the significance of this revelation. In her years of working with traumatized children, she had seen countless cases where verbal communication became impossible during times of extreme stress. The idea that a child might retain and use an alternative communication method months later spoke to both the depth of Emma's trauma and the remarkable effectiveness of Justice's training. Sarah reached into her uniform pocket and produced a small laminated CARTA training reference guide that she carried during school visits. "The signal Emma used today," she said, holding up the card so the court could see the illustrated hand. "Positions is the gesture for 'I need help feeling safe.' It's one of 5 basic signals we teach, but it's specifically designed for children who are experiencing emotional distress or feeling threatened." The card showed a simple illustration: a child's hand with the thumb pressed against the palm while the index and middle fingers curved slightly upward, exactly the gesture Emma had made while sitting in the witness chair. The image was accompanied by text explaining that this particular signal indicated a request for immediate emotional support and comfort, typically used when a child felt overwhelmed or unsafe. Attorney Rebecca Morrison, still reeling from the collapse of her carefully constructed case, found her voice long enough to pose the question that everyone was thinking. "But Officer Mitchell, how is it possible that the dog remembered one child from a classroom presentation 6 months ago? And how could he respond so specifically to her needs?" Sarah's expression softened with something approaching wonder as she looked at her remarkable partner. "Justice has what our trainers call exceptional emotional intelligence," she explained. "His ability to read micro-expressions, body language, and stress indicators is beyond anything we typically see, even in highly trained service animals. But what happened today goes beyond his training." She paused, gathering her thoughts before continuing with the honesty that the moment demanded. "The truth is, Your Honor, I've worked with Justice for 3 years, and I've never seen him respond to someone with this level of ... connection. Typically, he waits for my command before approaching anyone, but today he acted entirely on his own initiative. It's as if he recognized Emma not just as someone who needed help, but as someone he specifically needed to help." Judge Chun absorbed this information with the careful consideration of someone trained to weigh evidence and testimony. But her expression revealed that she was struggling to fit this extraordinary circumstance into any legal framework she had ever encountered. "Are you saying, Officer Mitchell, that this dog somehow remembered Emma from a single encounter 6 months ago and recognized her distress today?" "That's exactly what I'm saying, Your Honor," Sarah replied without hesitation. "But it's more than memory." Justice responded to Emma's signal with a behavior that isn't part of his standard training protocols. The way he positioned himself, the specific comfort gesture he provided, it was as if he understood not just that she needed help, but exactly what kind of help she needed. Officer Mitchell paused, her professional demeanor momentarily giving way to the awe of someone who had witnessed something truly miraculous. "In my opinion, Your Honor, what we've seen today represents a level of interspecies communication that science is only beginning to understand. Justice didn't just remember Emma. He recognized her as someone who belonged to him to protect." The explanation settled over the courtroom like a revelation, providing a rational framework for the extraordinary while acknowledging that some miracles transcend complete understanding. Emma's small hand continued to rest on Justice's head, both of them seeming utterly peaceful in the midst of the adult wonder surrounding their remarkable bond. Judge Margaret Chun rose from her bench with the solemnity of someone about to render a decision that would echo through the corridors of legal history. The storm outside had finally passed, leaving the courthouse windows streaked with rain that caught the emerging sunlight and cast dancing patterns across the courtroom floor. After 30 years of presiding over family disputes, custody battles, and the endless parade of human frailty that filled her docket, she had never felt the weight of judicial responsibility more acutely than in this moment. "In my 3 decades on this bench," Judge Chun began, her voice carrying the authority of experience, tempered by the wisdom of what she had just witnessed. I have seen countless custody cases, each one a tragedy of adults who have forgotten that their children's well-being must supersede their own pain and anger. But today, I have witnessed something that challenges not only my understanding of family law, but my comprehension of the very nature of communication, trust, and healing. The courtroom held its breath as Judge Chun's gaze moved deliberately from Emma, still seated in the witness chair, with Justice's protective presence beside her, to the feuding parents whose bitter warfare had created this extraordinary moment. Maria Rodriguez sat rigid in her chair, her perfectly applied makeup streaked with tears that had destroyed the mask of maternal concern she had worn throughout the proceedings. Beside her, attorney Rebecca Morrison appeared to have aged a decade. In the span of an hour, her burgundy suit wrinkled, and her confidence utterly shattered. David Rodriguez looked equally devastated, but his anguish carried a different quality, the raw grief of a man confronting the full magnitude of how his actions had damaged the child he loved more than his own life. His work-calloused hands trembled as he wiped tears from his weathered cheeks, and his attorney Marcus Thompson sat beside him in stunned silence, frantically rewriting legal strategies that had become irrelevant in the face of Emma's truth. Court finds, Judge Chun continued with deliberate precision, that both Maria and David Rodriguez have engaged in systematic emotional manipulation of their minor child, coaching her to provide false testimony for the purpose of gaining custody. Advantage. This behavior constitutes a form of psychological abuse that has caused immeasurable harm to Emma's emotional development and sense of security. The words landed like hammer blows in the silent courtroom. Maria Rodriguez let out a stifled sob, finally understanding that her carefully orchestrated campaign had not only failed, but had exposed her as unfit for the very custody she had fought so desperately to obtain. David's shoulders sagged with the weight of his own culpability, recognizing that his attempts to counter his ex-wife's manipulation had made him equally guilty of using his daughter as a weapon in their private war. Judge Chan's attention shifted to the gallery, where Rosa Martinez had sat throughout the proceedings with the quiet dignity of someone who understood that love sometimes meant staying silent until called upon. At 67, Emma's maternal grandmother had weathered her own share of life's storms: the death of her husband 5 years earlier, the painful dissolution of her daughter's marriage, and the heartbreak of watching her granddaughter become collateral damage in an adult conflict. Her silver hair was pulled back in a simple bun, and her worn hands were folded peacefully in her lap, but her dark eyes reflected the deep wells of wisdom that come from a lifetime of putting others' needs before her own. Rosa Martinez, Judge Chun said, and the older woman rose with graceful composure. Please approach the bench. Rosa walked forward with measured steps, her presence bringing an immediate sense of calm to the chaotic emotional atmosphere that had dominated the courtroom. She moved with the confidence of someone who had nothing to hide, no agenda beyond the well-being of a child she loved unconditionally. As she took her place before the judge, Emma's face lit up with the first genuine smile anyone had seen from her in months. Mrs. Martinez, Judge Chun continued, the court is prepared to award you temporary custody of Emma Rodriguez, pending a comprehensive family evaluation and mandatory counseling for both parents. However, given the extraordinary circumstances of today's proceedings, I am also implementing an unprecedented provision. The judge's gaze moved to Justice, who remained perfectly still beside Emma's chair, his amber eyes alert and watchful. Officer Mitchell, the court hereby orders that Justice be present for all future hearings, evaluations, and proceedings involving this family until such time as Emma's emotional stability is fully restored. This remarkable animal has demonstrated an ability to provide Emma with a sense of safety that allows her to speak her truth, and I will not deny her that support. A murmur of amazement rippled through the courtroom as the historic nature of Judge Chan's ruling sank in. Never before had a service animal been specifically assigned to assist a child throughout an entire custody process. But then again, no judge had ever witnessed anything like the communication that had transformed this proceeding. Emma slipped down from the witness chair and ran to her grandmother with the abandon of a child, finally free to express genuine emotion. Rose's arms enveloped her granddaughter in an embrace that seemed to contain all the unconditional love that had been missing from Emma's life during months of parental manipulation. The sight brought tears to every eye in the courtroom, a reminder of what family relationships should look like when not poisoned by adult resentment and competition. Furthermore, Judge Chan added, her voice taking on the tone of someone delivering a warning as much as a judgment. Both Maria and David Rodriguez will undergo immediate family counseling and parenting classes. Any further attempts to manipulate, coach, or use Emma as an instrument of revenge against each other will result in the permanent termination of parental rights. As Emma prepared to leave the courtroom with her grandmother, she turned back toward Justice one final time. The golden retriever had risen to his feet, his magnificent form radiating the same calm intelligence that had made their extraordinary connection possible. Emma's small hand formed the same subtle gesture she had used earlier, but this time its meaning had transformed from a desperate plea for help into a profound expression of gratitude. Justice's response was immediate and unmistakable. His tail wagged once, a single, deliberate movement that acknowledged their bond while promising that he would be there whenever she needed him again. The gesture brought tears to Judge Chan's eyes as she realized she had just witnessed not only the resolution of a custody dispute, but the beginning of a healing process that would be guided by the most unlikely of guardians, a dog who had somehow learned to speak the language of a broken child's heart.